And we're live.
Okay, great. Thank you very much, everyone. Welcome. My name is Edward Joseph. I'm here at Johns Hopkins SAIS with the Foreign Policy Institute. And it's my great pleasure to welcome back my former student and friend, Jasmin Cesko. Jasmin, welcome.
Thank you.
Great to have you here. And great to have you here in live in-person audience in our new home here on Pennsylvania Avenue. And great to have you watching online. So we have 1 hour to cover a lot of ground. And typically here at SAIS, you know, we get a lot of prominent speakers down on the video board. We have the reminder that the opening event here was with Secretary of State Antony Blinken. So we get a lot of those important figures, policy figures. And this event today is slightly different. We'll shed some light on policy, but this is a rare opportunity to have a personal story and to talk about someone's own personal journey. And that's what we're going to hear today, where Jasmin will tell us about, in a conversation with me, about his journey from the war in Bosnia and Herzegovina, in Eastern Bosnia, in Zepa, where he was from, all the way here to SAIS and beyond, and try to put it all together. So Jasmin, welcome.
Thank you. Thank you for having me here. Thank you and the SAIS and the Foreign Policy Institute for devoting the time. For Zepa, 29 years, almost 29 years later. And then thank you to everyone in the audience who came to hear us today, and then also folks who are tuning in via video. It's important, it's timely. You turn on the news, and I'm sure you students here are very well into what's going on in the rest of the world. And my story, my journey and the experience with the war as a child has influenced my thinking, my worldview, my values. And every time I turn on the news and I see these kids suffering or innocent, I see myself. And really, it's shaped who I've become and the things that I care about and the things that I stand for.
Yes, great. And let's get into that and let's tell the story. Let's first, if we could, explain our connection and how you and I met. Okay, so listen, why are the two of us here today talking about each other? So can you explain
Absolutely.
how we met?
So in 2016, I was a student here, just like the you. First day of spring semester 2016. I took the course that Professor Joseph co-taught with Professor Srebrenica, post-war stabilization and transition. So first day of class, Professor Joseph is doing the introduction. We're going around the room, and then my turn came. I introduced myself, Jasmin Cesko from Bosnia, and then he followed up with, "Where in Bosnia?" And I said, "Just a small town, Eastern Bosnia," not expecting that he would know where it is. And he follows with, "What small town, Eastern Bosnia?" I say, "Zepa." And then he sort of stopped and his eyes opened, and that's what he shared with me, that he was there. And he was the first non-Bosnian official or any non-Bosnian that I've ever met who was there during that time. So it was very interesting for me to learn about his perspective, the things that he was seeing, and share that with me. And thank you for being there that day, for doing that time period, for helping us escape, survive. And then also thank you for maintaining your connection to Bosnia after all these years, and really, talking about justice, talking about things that happened there, reminding people why Zepa matters. It still matters. It mattered then, it matters now. And Zepa is a small place, and we'll get more into that. It didn't have many influential voices in its corner, and you're one of those. So, thank you.
Thank you, Jasmin. I appreciate that. And I would say, just to reinforce what you are saying, is ironically, even in Bosnia, Zepa is sort of can be forgotten and completely overshadowed by its neighbor, which you also know and remember from it, which is Srebrenica. So even in Bosnia, Bosnians have a tendency to forget about it. And just to explain, for folks what Jasmin is referring to, is that I was in the war in Bosnia and Herzegovina for 3 years as a UN official. After Dayton Agreement, I was back with the U.S. Army as part of the NATO implementation force and then later OC. But during the war, I was there with the UN, and in July 1995, this is while the genocide is taking place in Srebrenica, which, as Jasmin will explain, walking distance from Zepa. I and one other UN official were sent because General Mladic had, for his own reasons, and obviously connected with his designs on Srebrenica and Zepa, allowed two UN civil affairs officers, and I was one, to coordinate the evacuation. And that's why I was so stunned to learn that Jasmin was in my classroom back in 2016, because effectively at some point I was literally or in some way putting him on the bus or the truck to get out of that besieged and quite vulnerable situation. So Jasmin, we talked about how you and I met. Now, for folks who know nothing about Zepa, may not know very much about the war. Let's just take, we're not going to only have, an hour that's rapidly dwindling, but let's give a little bit of context here. Tell us about the war and tell us how it came to be that these two small enclaves were even still around in Eastern Bosnia, that were surrounded basically by Bosnian Serbs. These are remote outposts. You have to understand that. Zepa, and especially very small enclaves with Srebrenica, but much larger. These are remote, not near Sarajevo, not in any kind of contiguity with the rest of what today we know as we call the Federation, Bosnia and Herzegovina. But this is isolated small places. That's right. And we had extremely limited access myself. But being with the UN, we had strictly regulated, extremely difficult access even for us as international to get to either Srebrenica or to Zepa or to Bosnia, which was the So, yes, if you could contextualize the war and how it came to be that Zepa was there as this isolated element.
Certainly. So, as many of you know, Bosnia, but Zepa in particular, is in a tough neighborhood. And that's an understatement. So we have a situation in that region where it never happened where a home was passed down to the next generation intact. Think about that. So what happened in World War II was even worse than what we went through in the 90s. And in the context of the Yugoslav wars and the solution of Yugoslavia, you had fighting in Slovenia, in Croatia. They preceded Bosnia and declared independence. So folks knew what was coming. Some people didn't want to believe it. Think about Yugoslavia. It was a project that was being built together for 50 years, and now it's falling apart. So in our village, there were 15 homes. Between the 15 homes, there were 3 hunting rifles. So starting before 92, 91 even, the men, my dad and his cousins would do nightly patrols to make sure that what happened in World War II didn't happen. In World War II, 72 of my relatives were burned alive in 3 homes, mostly women and children. And my grandmother and people her age remembered that. So there was a fear of this repeating. What happened after, so Zepa is a region, Eastern Bosnia. It wasn't a municipality. It numbered 22 villages on the outskirts spread out. Zepa town itself was a valley, is a valley. And the way I describe it, you come to Zepa, you feel like you're at a dead end. You come down this windy, narrow road. There's a beautiful Drina River, surrounded by mountains. And to get out, you have to go the way it is. So as the war started in Bosnia, after Bosnian independence, Zepa was
1992.
1992. Zepa was 100 kilometers away from any major free territory that was under the control of the Bosnian government. So we were isolated. The Bosnian government recognized this, and that they requested that these safe zones be declared. And Zepa was declared a safe zone in May of '93. And that's when we had Ukrainian peacekeepers come and monitor the situation. And we'll get more into those details. So what ended up happening as the war got closer, those villages on the outskirts became unsafe. So folks sought refuge in the town center. So pre-war population of Zepa was 5,000 across all those 22 villages. By the time the evacuation came, there were 6,000 people just in the town center. Srebrenica, similar situation, much bigger, more villages, bigger population. They were also declared a safe. They had the Dutch peacekeepers.
And yes, so let me just build on that. So you understand what Jasmin is talking about, this safe area resolution. This is a part of the UN Security Council. These were basically substitutes for intervention. So this is contextually what was taking place. This is very simplified here because we don't have a lot of time. But for those of you who just don't have the experience or background in this, Yugoslavia, as Jasmin was explaining, was this unified entity where it had a unified identity, a national identity as Yugoslavia. They just celebrated the 40th anniversary of the Olympics, the Sarajevo Olympics of 1984. They just celebrated. This was a huge event, unifying event, 1984, the Olympics. And then Tito dies in 1980. And Milosevic comes to power in the late 80s on the Kosovo question, still roiling the region right now. And what was the international response? The international response was captured by then Secretary of State James Baker, who said famously, "We don't have a dog in that fight." So that was basically the green light. And what you had was, as Yugoslavia disintegrated, and again, I don't have time to give what actually transpired, the catalyst, and how Kosovo was exploited to bring that. But the key question here for Bosnians living in a place like Zepa was the weapons. So what happened is Belgrade, the government in Belgrade, led by Slobodan Milosevic, inherited the weapon, particularly the heavy weapons, and proceeded to carry out a very aggressive attempt to create new borders and new realities, including something called Republika Srpska, which never existed. I mean, Kosovo existed. Bosnia-Herzegovina existed, but there was never such a thing as Republika Srpska, and proceeded to try forcibly, once Bosnia-Herzegovina declared independence, to create forcibly this state, effectively, Republika Srpska, through what we then learned the term ethnic cleansing. So the area around, this is what's so remarkable, why I keep pointing about, asking us, how is it that Zepa was even there? Because elsewhere in the Republic of Serbia, there had already been this horrible, massive ethnic cleansing, including not very far from the bigger towns of Srebrenica. It's terrible war crimes and atrocities that took place in nearby Revizhina. So, and by the way, all of this, Jasmin is skipping over some things in his description. I have to tell you, Zepa is a beautiful place. Incredibly, this gorge that he describes as you go down there, that one, you go in and leave it. It's incredibly densely forested. It's absolutely stunning. And just to mention, those of you who know the famous author Ivo Andrić, who won the Nobel Prize for Literature, the famous Bridge of the Drina, that's Visegrad, but there's another story with the bridge in Zepa. And there is a small old Turkish bridge. So the history goes back, the fear goes back. This was exploited their Serbs have also exploited this to say, oh, the Muslims have lists of names and exploited these fears, stretching even back from World War II. And so whipping up this mutual animosity and fear. So we have that now. Jasmin, you've taken us there now. You're there. You tell us what life was like during the war in Zepa, in this very isolated situation, and then if you can bring us to these climatic events of July 11th.
Extremely isolated. So after Bosnian declared independence, March 1992, barricades were put down between major cities and towns, so nothing could leave or enter Zepa starting April 92. Between April and June, there were attempts to negotiate with the Serbian authorities. So after Bosnia declared independence, Bosnian Serbs declared Serb Republic of Bosnia, which they later rebranded as Republic of Srpska, and a full-scale war started. In other parts of the country, Sarajevo was under siege, it was being bombarded, and we were cut off in Zepa, small town. The most difficult time period was between that later that year, from September until May of 90. Hunger. There was no food. Thankfully for my family, we had a cow. Cow produces milk that helped sustain us.
How old were you?
I was 5. So the cow ended up being wounded from artillery fire. My uncle, who was a doctor, one of the 3 doctors with Zepa, stitched her up, and she survived. So when I think back, I am not supposed to be here. None of us are supposed to be here. No, the refugees from Zepa and Bosnia. We were bombarded by heavy artillery. Airplanes taking off from Užice in Serbia. We had, by the end of the war, the Bosnian military in Zepa had no more than 700 rifles, 6 to 7. The line of defense was 49 kilometers. So imagine trying to hold that line for 3+ years with that little ammunition and firepower. It goes to show you the resilience, the strength of the people, of the inhabitants of Zepa. Living in Zepa before the war wasn't easy. It was isolated, it was underdeveloped, it was primarily agricultural, farming, logging industry. So I'll go back to the attempts to negotiate with the Serbs, who had demands that we surrender unconditionally, and then that the Serb military entered the town and the villages. This was unacceptable because people knew in other parts of the country where they entered what happened. If you disarm, they came in. So this was the master plan. So you go, we'll get more into this later about the reconciliation and different viewpoints, but there was a clear, there were warring parties, and one was the clear transgressor, with a master plan to eradicate the Bosniak Muslim population from that territory. This was confirmed by the courts, international tribunals. The attempt to revise history is ongoing. And that's why conversations like they are important, so that we don't forget. So going back to 92, the Serbs attempt to take Mount Slover, which was the highest point. They come with a convoy of 350 men. And this was the turning point battle for Zepa and its survival. Outgunned, outmanned, the Bosnian army ends up capturing the convoy, taking hostages, 35 Bosnian Serb soldiers, but most importantly, taking ammunition and weapons. This was critical for later on. Also, those hostages were released and exchanged for provisions, gas,
Prisoners of war. Yeah.
For gas, fuel, food. But really, the hardest, the most difficult period was September 92 until May of 93, until Zepa was declared a safe zone, where you could get convoys of aid in. That it's hard to describe to someone who didn't experience war what that was like. And it's hard for anyone to comprehend if you didn't witness it yourself. And people were forced to make bread out of grains that were supposed to be given to cattle. And me being little and picky, I didn't want to eat that bread. So my parents always made an effort to keep like a little bag of white flour to make just one little biscuit for me when I needed it. So we didn't have much, but people stuck together. People were resilient, they were strong, they relied on each other to survive. And I had this conversation with my parents. They're not sure how we survived in those circumstances.
It's for those who haven't been exposed to that, it really is remarkable. The other thing I would point out that's very different from in the 1990s was the isolation was not only food and medicine, it was also information. There were no cell phones in those days. There was no internet. I can tell you, now look, as you were an official, I was in some isolated places, including later Zepa, but obviously I had much better access. But still, we ourselves had very limited information about what we relied on shortwave radio, BBC, shortwave radio. Things were very different. The isolation, the fear, and I know this from my own time in Croatia, parts of Croatia, the people were incredibly isolated. The rumors abounded. What the Serbs are going to do. There's movements, tanks, and so forth. It was a very, very different environment. So, Jasmin, the other thing we have to mention, of course, here is about weapons. And note about this ability to take the weapons and ammunition was transformative. Bosnia was under an arms embargo. There was a complete arms embargo. So not only was there no Western military intervention, but the arms embargo throws in place this incredible imbalance. So you talked about jets. Bosnia had no jets. Very few helicopters or tanks, heavy weapons. So there was this incredible imbalance. And that imbalance, that's really what drove so much of the dynamics of the war. Now, can you take us, Jasmin, that we understand the deprivation that you and your family were under? Bring us to how we get, and you're saying this was improved somewhat by when the small Ukrainian detachment came. Tell us actually first this, your connection with Srebrenica. how much connection to Srebrenica? Were you ever in Srebrenica? Explain that, because so many people here and watching at home will be familiar with Srebrenica. What did you all know and experience in the area?
So Zepa is not that far from Srebrenica. I think driving it's like 25 to 26 kilometers. Often people went to the mountains to get, food and provisions while they could from Srebrenica, bring it back to Zepa.
With a larger on,
Much larger. So the word got around about massacres. So you mentioned Besieged, and we talked about negotiations and to pledge loyalty to the Bosnian Serb authorities. That changed when the bodies started flowing down the river, and people said, "This is not an option." When it comes to Srebrenica, because it was bigger, had more resources, some people from Zepa, including my parents, thought it might be a better option to go there. And we went.
how did you take them?
So on our way there, and I'll tell you the story because the grandson of the gentleman who saved our life is here with us. So we were on the back of a truck driving to Srebrenica, and we were going around the curve. Around the curve comes this older man without shoes, his coat open, telling us to stop. The truck that he was in, that was in front of us, was ambushed. Everybody was killed. He escaped through the back. And he told us, stop the truck that we were in, turn around. And that saved our life.
You have to understand, they're moving through what you would consider enemy territory. So when he just says sort of matter of fact, oh, we were driving to Serb, but you were driving to Serb-controlled territory. They would kill you. This is it, and this ambush happened. So continue. So yes.
And what's important to mention is the grandson of that gentleman is here with us, and it's a bond and sense of gratefulness that I feel, toward his entire family, because truly it saved our life. And there were so many close calls like that. I remember we couldn't stay inside because they were targeting buildings. So we'd have to go in the shelters in the basements. And I remember being a little kid, just seeing at night projectiles falling. And as a kid, I thought this was normal. I didn't know anything else. Until, and I'll admit this to you, probably till college here, when one of my former roommates said how his parents got him a goldfish to learn the concept of death. And I thought to myself, I learned about that a lot differently many years ago. But going back to Srebrenica, what happened there was the worst atrocity, worst massacre in European soil since the Holocaust, where they killed over 8,000 men and boys in 3 days. They separated them from women, and they killed them, buried them in mass graves, and then there are instances where they hid the mass graves and buried and reburied 3-4 times. And it was recently in the news, you probably saw this in the town of Portugal. There's a doctor. They found a victim from the genocide in his front lawn under his fountain because he was doing experiments on body.
Yesterday they found near Kislyak. This is a different part of the central Bosnia. But another body was just found and identified yesterday. So again, you think, oh, this is so distant in the past. And it was identified. They did DNA testing. Yes, so you just to get our chronology, keep our chronology. So your family makes it to Srebrenica, but then you return to Zepa, correct?
Correct. We went back to Zepa. I'm not familiar with the details because I remember more of my first memories are not of Disney World and fun things. It's of that chaos and the fall of them. So really what I remember is 95.
Is 95. Okay, you're so young, these are your first formative
First
memories. Okay, so let's come then, you sketched out what life is like during the war, the deprivation, the isolation, the fear, the death. That, as you say, that you, even as a child, you could perceive. And so take us to this culminating moment, July 1995, Srebrenica and Zepa. Describe this either contextual or how you perceive it.
So after, and it's important to provide that context as well, after the arrival of the UN peacekeepers, things were somewhat better in terms of offensives. That they weren't trying to actively conquer, and attack Zepa. And it's important to mention, and we didn't cover this, the issues that we had with the UN peacekeepers who were in charge of protecting these safe zones, both in Srebrenica and in Zepa. In Zepa in particular, we had about 80 Ukrainian soldiers, and those were not the Ukrainians of today that we have sympathy for. They were, allegations exist that they were very much in collusion with the Bosnian Serb soldiers, allegations of trade for fuel, for ammunition, for food, even that they were bringing, Bosnian Serb soldiers into the UN base in Zepa. So, despite the difficulty, the Bosnian military and the political leadership that you knew very well as well, had to maintain order. So think about chaos, fear, people are losing loved ones. And by this point, my mom lost both of her brothers. My grandma lost her husband later on, and then she also lost her brother. And I remember vividly, there's in the town square, there's fountains, gatherings of where they read the lists of people who died. And when women heard the name of a loved one, I remember the shrieks, cries. And I used to run away so I wouldn't hear it. And I just remember it being so colorful, the women wearing their headscarves and this was normal. So after the fall of Srebrenica, we're all gathered in Zepa. We heard about the fall, we heard about the atrocities. Some people escaped the mountains, they got to Zepa. So after Srebrenica fell, really the Bosnian Serb army, Mladic, they turned their focus to Zepa. And they attacked Zepa with 5 brigades. And Zepa was able to hold the lines for 15 days. And these 15 days were crucial for what happened in other parts of Bosnia, namely what happened in Gorazde, which was another UN safe haven, and what happened with the Croatian offensive in the west, because it kept the Bosnian Serb army occupied in Zepa and bought enough time on other fronts to reinforce and for them to not, get there in time, essentially.
I could just jump in, Jasmin, and say that I'm a witness to this. What Jasmin is saying, you have to understand that this is a crucial moment in not just Bosnia, but really European history, because this is Srebrenica, the massacre, the genocide taking place there. 8,000 men and boys. And by the way, there's video evidence of this that has been released, the famous Scorpions video. It's horrifying. But anyone who doubts or would like to revise or whatever, there's video evidence of these men being executed at post range. So there should be absolutely no doubt, and it's so thoroughly documented. But I just want to emphasize the critical role that Zepa played here, what that Jasmin has mentioned. So Srebrenica, this larger army, General Mladic takes. And now he's going to move to the smaller one, the much smaller one and this should go like this, but it didn't. It didn't just fall. It should have been a snap. And I know this from my own experience because Mladic, thinking he had Zepa in the bag, that's when he invited us to come. And so we came, this was about, I don't know, the 18th or 19th of July. Srebrenica fell the 11th. You understand the proximity in time? This is over the same period. So we were told to come, and Zepa had not fallen. And because it hadn't fallen, this was this allowed, as Jasmin mentioned, both in Beraje and then in the far west of the country, the climactic advance of the Croatian army, the Hague and Hague working then in unison with the army of Hague together. This is the climactic ground force that later combined with naval air power to create the conditions for the end of the war. And what could have been a much better peace, but that's an element for another day. And we're really the great missed opportunity for a stable peace that were all the Serbs across the Balkans and living together and everyone else prosperously together. But unfortunately, that opportunity was missed. But can you tell us, Jasmin, how it was that Zepa was able to hold out? You're now surrounded there. We could hear the artillery. I'm telling you, I'm a witness to this. So we could hear the psychological operations. They had loudspeakers, if you remember. We could see and hear the loudspeakers. We saw this when we were told. Mladic thought everything would be a snap, but it wasn't. Zepa didn't fall. We were led there, the Kazakh commander, I later met, I consider him to be a great hero, was Abdul College. How is it that Colonel Abdul College and the soldiers that he led and the people that he led in Zepa were able to sustain this and prevent the immediate fall?
Well, it was some skillful leadership because, and I keep emphasizing this, in times of panic, chaos, maintaining order and maintaining morale was paramount. So my dad was one of those people in the front lines. I think the motivation knowing that you're defending your loved ones. Everything you love and care about is behind you. Your wife, your mother, your kids. If the line falls, you know what's coming. Because remember, we've already had 3 years of war. We know what transpired in Srebrenica just a couple of weeks earlier. But we also know about what happened in Sarajevo, what happened in Besieged. And there was a great deal of panic, especially among the female population, about rapes, about mass killings. And I think this motivation, but also the leadership, they were, and I don't want to get too much into the details, but the chief of staff was on the mountain with his soldiers, and he controlled the communication with college and then the authorities in Sarajevo. And they told Zepa, promised Zepa, hold out until the 23rd. There's a big peace conference happening in Split. Whatever you need to do, hold out. The 23rd came and went by. Peace conference didn't happen, and the outcome that they thought would happen didn't happen. But they also didn't want to make the mistake of surrendering. In Srebrenica, they convinced the Bosnian army to surrender, put down your arms, you're in a UN safe haven zone, it will be protected. In Zepa, the decision was different. The army said, we are not surrendering. We will keep fighting. We will keep fighting, but we will not surrender. And that's when the negotiations for evacuations started. And even after the civilian population evacuated from Zepa, the Bosnian army of Zepa didn't surrender. And what they ended up doing was most of them, some of them crossed into liberated territory on foot through many weeks and days to the mountains. But the biggest portion, including my dad, crossed the Drina River into Serbia proper, and they surrendered there to they were captured by what was still the JNA Yugoslav forces, and they were registered by the International Red Cross, and then they were, in that sense, protected from being executed and having the same fate as the men of the.
And exactly, and yes, I just want to point out the heroism of college and all of you, including your father, of holding out in this incredibly outnumbered situation. Again, he's already taken knowledge. Srebrenica is a much larger place than Zepa. Yet there is this reluctance to move. And I want to reinforce the point that you mentioned about the fear, because I witnessed this. When we then arrived back the second time and were allowed to go into Zepa, we were told, UNHCR had told us, look, what you need to do when you carry out this evacuation is you have to make sure that it's voluntary. How is it voluntary? This is the military, their places being taken. So that you have to make sure. So we, well, the first day of the evacuation were women and children. This would have been Yasmin and this month, eventually on successive days. But we're there gathered in the small village center. And I proceeded with my colleague to go around, and I was very careful to take names because I had been in Tuzla when the women had come from Srebrenica earlier that month, and met some were traumatized, some were grieved. And so I was very determined to write down everyone's name and to make sure the Serbs knew that we had everyone's name. And if they boarded the bus here, that those lists were going to be given to the Red Cross and be monitored, and everyone was going to be counted. And to make this very visible to them. And so we went around, and just quickly to tell you, asking each of these moms who was there gathered with their kids, are you voluntarily agree to leave and to evacuate Zepa? They would all, nod their head like this until I came to one woman who said, I said, do you voluntarily agree to leave? And she says to me, no. She said, I would like to stay in my home, but who will protect me? And then she burst into tears. Everyone, all the other women burst into tears. Truth obviously came out. We were terrified. Because every time there was a sort of jeep, they would deliberately drive through to sort of raise the fear, the flag, the sort of flag. It was absolute panic. It was people were terrified by this, and for good reason, and for very good reason. And again, you all, we didn't know exactly what really had to happen. But I did have my suspicions, and I spoke to General about it, and I was quickly excited because there was talk that there would be a prisoner exchange. Your father and others would be allowed to leave in some kind of mass evacuation, and in exchange for serving prisoners at war. And I asked Monish, I said to him, would you actually let these men leave and cross into the free territory, the Bosnian controlled territory? And Monish looked at me and he said, yes, except for the workmen. So this was mentality of this guy. Meanwhile, they're still slaughtering up the road, but this is the mentality of him. And by the way, he's just heard his request for medical treatment for Dr. Now, Jasmin, take us to your own personal story of leaving Zepa with your family. What happened, and what was it like?
So I remember, I brought this toy, and I think I told you some of you before we started. This was pretty much the only toy I had during the war, and I kept it during the evacuation and since. It was gifted to me by a girl who was a couple years older than me, and I'm happy to share that she also survived in her family, and she calls Richmond, Virginia home now, and lives there. It's happily married. And I'll tell you more about the significance of this in a little bit, but there was a lot of mistrust. So the first wave of buses came to start evacuations, and people were reluctant to get on because people knew that these were Bosnian Serb drivers. It was a coordinated effort. What will happen to us? So I remember buses leaving empty because people were afraid. Eventually, the military leadership convinced the civilians this is the way to go, and the panic was people were afraid to sweep inside. And I remember everybody, all 6,000 people were outside, including in the cemetery, in the town square. Everybody was afraid to be inside a building because they thought, you know, that the Serbs would target the infrastructure waiting for territory. So I was there with my mom, my grandmother, my aunt, and my dad to put us on the very last truck that was leaving Zepa as part of the evacuation that day. So we didn't get on a bus, there was no seats, but there was a truck, there was a cargo truck, tarp, put us on, and prior to us leaving, you know, if you had any money or jewelry, you would stop, they would take it and kill you. So I remember my mom, I had sweatpants, and then the lining she undid, and she put 100 German marks inside, and then she sewed it back up. That was all the money that we had. And she had a small knife, and I remember cutting through the tarp, and we could see Zepa as we're leaving. My dad was there, just standing in his uniform. And we didn't know it was each other. This was it. So I had this, and the convoy got to Klein, which was the border town, well, not the border town, but the next liberated territory. And we got off. So now we're walking, and there's all these Bosnian Serb checkpoints. And we're all exhausted, scared. You can see there was a stream, I remember. You can see dead bodies. These were people who tried to escape on foot, and they were just going out. And I'm walking with my mom, and then we come across a checkpoint, and it's, you know, and I remember this big, tall soldier, big mustache, pulls me aside, yanks me, and this boy, I drop it, you know. And I'm struggling to pick him up. I don't want to leave him behind. And then he's holding me by the collar. He takes out a knife, and he says to my mom, "He's staying with us?" And my mom just puts down her bag and says, "If he stays." They were probably not going to do anything because the scrutiny was too much at that point. But it was just an intimidation and fear. So anyway, we continued on foot. We got to Kladan, and there was a Red Cross who set up a camp. It was white tents. My uncle greeted us. My uncle, my dad's brother, he lives in Michigan now. He was wearing a uniform. My dad always wore a uniform during the war, and he looked a lot like my dad. So I ran up to him. I hugged his leg, my mom. You know, so. And then I remember he would come visit us with Kakan, and then, I mean, that was my childhood. I remember most people don't remember their first watermelon, first banana, but I remember when he came and brought us a watermelon after the war, and I ate so much that for the next like 5 years, I couldn't eat watermelon. I got sick of it. You know? So it's, and then the really the unknown, professor stated there was no phones, there was no cell phones, you didn't know. You didn't know what happened to my dad. We made it. You didn't know what happened to our other relatives, my grandmother, my aunt. You simply didn't know. So after, we settled in Kakan, we started, Red Cross came into the concentration camp, Shio, that's where my dad was, and he was able to send letters. So we heard that he was alive, and we could get letters from him. And I remember, when we write back, my mom always made me draw my hand to see how big I got. And then he was eventually released 10 months later, following his second birthday. But they, and we can get more into that, but really the conditions at the camp, it was torture, beatings, and no one was ever held responsible. This was in Serbia proper. There's no, commemoration or charges or any sense of justice. And same thing with Zepa. Zepa told me he was the only one who was sentenced to life in prison and died in jail. But the Bosnian domestic courts, they never brought charges against anybody. So
I just mentioned I testified in that case in the Hague Tribunal case, which is important. But what's important about the Zepa verdict is that it directly undermines the claims that are made to try to weaken the convictions about Srebrenica, because if it were not genocidal intent, why go after Zepa at all? After all, Srebrenica was the larger. So what was the threat that was posed from this much smaller? So it was very important quickly, because we're going to come to SAIS in a second, Russell. But I have to just acknowledge, as you mentioned, again, the heroism of Opera College, the colonel who stayed behind, he stayed with us in the compound. He didn't have to be there. He was there voluntarily. He wanted to ensure that every last civilian we were allowed to evacuate the women, the children, and the wounded, seriously men. So he stayed behind. He didn't have to. He could have been with that group that, as you said, that eventually made their way across the Drina River into Serbia. But he stayed and he paid for that group. So I always try to acknowledge the heroism that I witnessed. I saw the way he dealt with the Serbs. He's utterly alone there, in uniform, surrounded by all of these Serbs, dealing with Mladic, dealing with General Tolomir, Milan Vera. How he maintained, I will just tell you, honestly, his dignity, his courage, it was absolutely remarkable. But again, he paid for it with his life. So eventually, I'm in contact with his widow, Esther, who of course has kept his memory alive. His remains were finally recovered and were buried in Sarajevo on Passion. There in Sarajevo. So I wanted to just know that now, in the time we have remaining, Nelson, tell us, okay, you reunited with your father. Thank you, after this incredibly harrowing experience of years of isolation, then this terrifying experience of a knife putting his throat, even the last footsteps you have to deal with this trauma. You reunited with your father, thank you. You make your way to the United States. Can you tell us about that and how you came here to SAIS? And if you would, what's so compelling, especially today with everything that's going on, tell us who you met with, who became your friends, and how that informed your viewing and give you some perspective.
Absolutely. And briefly, I'll just mention that after my dad was released, we were reunited. we settled in Sarajevo, where we lived for the next 5 years until we decided to come. Just like my family, the entire Bosnian Muslim population was expelled from the territory that was controlled by the Muslims. Zepa, Srebrenica, all of Eastern Bosnia, everywhere where the Bosnian Serb soldiers set foot, the Muslims were expelled. Their homes were destroyed. There were wherever wherever they captured, every town they destroyed the mosques. 614 mosques total. Not a single one was left standing, and some of them were national monuments built by the Ottomans years ago. Zepa itself had 4 mosques, all 4 were destroyed. They had 6 schools, everything was destroyed. So they destroyed the entire infrastructure. They destroyed a way of life, and Zepa was not a strategic location. It didn't have an industry, didn't have a railroad. They wanted a purely homogeneous population of Serbs living in the area, and they wanted to kill and bury the Muslims and destroy any trace as if they had never existed. So now us and tens of thousands of internal refugees, displaced people in Sarajevo and other parts of Bosnia, you cannot go back. You cannot go back to Zepa. For the next 5 years, there was no way to go back to your home, go back to. So I remember my parents had this conversation. We have 2 options. Either we go back, live under a tent with no security, no school, no hospital, or we come to France. So we came to New Hampshire in 2001. Welcome. It's very difficult for my parents to jobs, they didn't know the language. I graduated from the University of New Hampshire, and there I met a great dear friend now, professor, mentor, professor Lawrence Reardon, and he's also a SAIS alumnus. So when I was working into graduate school programs, he recommended that I come to SAIS. Some reasons that you guys are. It's an academic program that will challenge you, that will open up the world for you. You've got an opportunity to spend the first year at Bologna, to see the world. And here, really, I made friendships and connections that will last a lifetime. And among my 3 closest friends here were 3 Serbians. And what's unique, especially in the US, is all of these Balkan people, they get along very well. It's a phenomenon. They'll do businesses together, they'll be friends, they'll go to concerts together, they'll play sports. I think, folks realize that here we have a lot more in common, things that unite us that are different. So one of the sort of my dear friend Georgian Milosevic. So I remember the first time meeting him at a bar in Bologna, and so I haven't met him before, and I don't know how he is. And he introduces himself, Georgian Milosevic, no relation. And I'll never forget that, So, and we became friends. And here at SAIS, we did the Peace Kids workshop offered by Professor Jasmin, where we went into inner city schools in DC to talk about conflict management. So it was a Bosnian, a Serb, talking about our experiences, our worldviews, how to overcome conflict, how to talk about things respectfully. And I credit my parents for raising me in such a way, despite what they went through, to not hate, because hate is a word, hate's heavy. Not everyone's the same. So judge a person by their character, the way they conduct themselves, not what their name is, creed, color, etc. And my dad, he maintains relations with Serbs who call him for Christmas, when he goes back to Bosnia. We'll see that. And then growing up, I saw this, and so I didn't have those, negative, prejudice about having Serbian friends. But I've also met Serbs who I couldn't be friends with, But my dear friends here, 3 of them hear from SAIS. I think, we're gonna be lifelong friends, and our kids are gonna be friends, and there'll be more opportunities for us to talk about these things and hopefully make an impact, set an example where these things don't happen. But it's also important for us to have conversations like this and remind and teach, what happened, why it happened, and then to be strong enough to prevent it from happening.
Yeah, so let me ask you, can you share again, by way of something that the students can take from this, how you and Marco and your other friends from Serbia, how did you approach I understand, you broke the ice and you found these things that you had in common. But how were you able to have conversations about arguments, about the conduct of the war, about what happened? How can you share something about that that can be enlightened?
So all of us, everybody here, we all have personal experiences in history, and when it comes to the war, that shaped me, and they also witnessed things that traumatized them. The 99 naval bomb, Serbia. They have their views on Kosovo, but we were always able to talk about these things in a respectful manner. And to be quite frank, this wasn't like a dominant topic. I'm too busy with SAIS and homework, and studying, etc. We did that stuff together as well. But what's important for me, and not just concerning them, but as a survivor of the genocide, is I don't seek validation from especially Serbs. There's this notion now where people are denying that the genocide happened, or they're downplaying. To me, that's a red line. So, here folks are obviously going through the Holocaust. How do we treat someone we come across who denies the existence of Holocaust without reason? We think they're crazy. We're not going to associate it. It's the same thing for us. Our pain, these are our wounds. I grew up with this. My grandmother lost both of her sons. One of them she never found, and her husband and her brother. She's never gone back to Zepa. Her heart couldn't take. She's never gone back to Zepa to visit their kids. That was my reality. She cries every day. 29 years later, I don't think there's a day where she doesn't shed it. These things shape me. This is not personal. This is in my heart. If you tell me, hey, that didn't happen, or you try to advise something, we can't have a conversation for us. And there are these attempts, very aggressive attempts to do this in Bosnia. But we shouldn't waste our energy. We should commemorate. We should teach our kids. I have a 6-month-old son. I need to take him back to Zepa. I need to show, need to educate. I need to get him to love it the way I love it. I love it as a kid, despite the difficulty I suffered there. But the easiest thing for me would be, I live in DC, I live in America, it's safe. Just forget it. It's 29 years. No. If we were to do that, bad guys. If I lose my identity, if I forget my language, if I forget my religion, if I forget where I came from, the bad guys. We didn't come here, because we wanted to, of course. So now it's our duty to talk to everyone who's going to listen and our own families about what happened. But that shouldn't prevent us, because we demand respect from the other side as well. Say, hey, that was terrible. And I don't know why it's so difficult for the mainstream society and the Balkans, especially the Serbs, to say we had some poor leaders, we did some terrible things. We condemn them, we distance ourselves from them, instead of making excuses over and over. So, SAIS is a great place where you'll meet people from different areas and from countries that are in conflict with each other. And what a great venue to talk about these things, to learn from each other about each other's experiences, and to be respectful of each other. Because we live in a very, polarized world, especially here, and then we need more positivity, but we also need to be respectful of each other's pain, moments.
Very well said. Jasmin, Brad, okay, can we go on a little bit longer?
Sure. Yes.
So I think we'll take a few questions there. I know we're at the end of our hour. You're just again fulfilling my role as sort of the the SAIS moderator, and he's not the model docile. Let me just say, apropos this last point about why Serbs cannot just simply acknowledge and say, hey, we have bad leaders. Let me just quickly say that there wasn't no. And this is the really sad. But it's very important to remember this in case someone goes, oh, Balkans, you can never get over it. It's not true. It's simply not true. The previous president of the Republic of Serbia, not the current one whose name we're not going to waste our time mentioning today, but the previous one named Dragan Čavić, went on television. This was 2006. I have it in the report that I wrote from Crisis to Convergence report. It's in there with a list, including he pressed by the then representative, who was Patty Ashton. Čavić, as president of the Republic of Serbia, went on television and he apologized for Serbians. And you may not have mentioned Zepa, but this was clearly intended. And it was done in a way, it wasn't just the word that he used, and they were not absolutely categorical, like everyone necessarily would have insisted upon. But it was emotional, and it was taken as genuine by even survivors. That it was proof that it was possible to move forward. And it was a time when, as this is noted in our period of links from Crisis to Convergence, it's on the Sunset website. In Republic of Serbia, they broadcast what was going on in the country. It was a different era. So the point you're making is correct. This attempts this revisionism. This is top down. And this is like that. I should point out one other last thing. Even in Belgrade in 2010, this is 2 years before Alexander Vučić and his compatriots came to power. And we know the roles and the comments that Vučić, I remember more in his comments in July 1995 as a member of the Soviet Party. These notorious comments, which I'm not going to read together. But the Serbian parliament in 2010 essentially acknowledged the genocide in Srebrenica by the way it accepted the report of the election. So, and even human rights figures in Belgrade said that this was a major step. So these things are they depend on leadership. And there was leadership at the time in the Republic of Serbia and in Serbia that saw Serbia moving forward and saw the need to move past these items. And instead, what we got is guys who want to take the part and turn the part down. And that's unfortunately what we see. Let me quickly, we just have a few minutes here before we close, but if there's any questions or comments, please.
I have a journalist and secondary PhD student here, so I'm planning my dissertation on Bosnia. I think in conjunction with Kosovo, Somalia, Haiti, on the kind of humanitarian conventions from the 90s. And I couldn't agree more that it's being forgotten about in the US and it's being undermined in the Balkans and sort of being swept under the rug, I would say, under a very broad umbrella of all those forever wars of war on terror era. And my contention is there's a huge world of difference between the 90s and the post 9/11 interventions, if anything, the snitch strand of history that the 90s constituted, where after 9/11, no one's talking about how can we help in a very disinterested way, groups that are suffering, right? Is different. But anyway, this is a whole other question. But I guess apart from the highly specific story you've told here, the very fraught relationship described with the Ukrainian peacekeepers, do you think the kind of blue helmet solution has a role to play, especially in the world where the U.S. is going to be very antsy about having boots on the ground from the U.S. for quite some time to come? Or do you think the experience you saw is that you have to be really, really careful in the impartiality and the lack of corruption among those troops that they can be worse than not having boots on the ground at all? Obviously, you experienced this as a child, but also kind of reflected on it later as a policy practitioner. But
so looking back and talking to people who are shut down Srebrenica, there's a great deal of mistrust for the outlets, and it's considered to be UN's biggest failure in modern history, where they handed, a silver platter the population to be butchered. There's no excuse for this. So some will argue, well, they were not adequately armed, or their mandate wasn't clear enough, or they didn't have the book cover that they needed. But you go back and see videos and pictures, those UN soldiers partying, drinking, feasting with the Serbs as the massacre went out. There's no excuse for this. A similar thing was happening. So I think, and we're seeing it, we say never again, but think about how many massacres and conflicts have happened since the Bosnia. It's happening in Gaza today. Where's the intervention? So for us, but also I think was also unfortunate timing. Political process here, the election, getting Black Hawk down, Rwanda and Somalia. There's a lot of different things. But for us, what really handicapped our response was the embargo. So I think they learned something, looking at the response in Ukraine and the level of aid it's getting. But as far as putting blue helmets and using these forces to maintain peace, I think it has to come with more political will, and you have to provide adequate support and adequate cover for these things to be successful, because then you risk catastrophic failure. And there were some things that happened in Haiti a few years ago. So it's a recurring theme that this needs to be addressed. And as a Bosnian, I always tell people that I'll end it on here. We cannot, and there's a risk of future conflict. Absolutely. They're broadcasting it now. They're arming the police, they're doing the parades, they're shutting down roads again. They're broadcasting it again. So we cannot sit here in the US or in Bosnia. I'm saying as a Bosnian American, we need to be, aware and proactive to prevent this from happening. Because what's going to help us is being in a position of strength, not waiting for an outside third party to intervene our behalf. And I think that's changing. So we no longer see ourselves as victims. We are survivors, we are strong. We've been here almost 20, 30 years. We're becoming educated, we're starting businesses, we're entrepreneurs, we learn the system, that we're living in, we're contributing members of society. And we're starting to put pressure on our, elected officials here, because we also have legitimate needs and concerns that, concern both the interests of the United States and Bosnia in the region. And one of those is really at the moment.
Let me quickly add, it's a very interesting question you raised, and I'll give the perspective of someone who was part of the peacekeeping apparatus before, and then later with IFOR. Just one of the critical things is, and the UN, to its credit, learned from the tragedy of Srebrenica. And I commend you should read the UN's own report on Srebrenica and the changes that it made, and that it moved away from this concept of neutrality and the importance. This is what's so critical: the importance of having a clear-eyed view on the actions of the combatants, and to not relativize. And what happened during the war, and I'll tell you, so this was the tendency, the operative tendency within the UN during the war, and I know this from having 3 years during the war, was to all sides have committed atrocities, all sides, and there was this relativizing. And we know factually, based on we know from the Hague Tribunal and so forth, that this was not the case. That there was no balance. Yes, there were. It wasn't the Serbs who only committed war crimes, but this industrial scare was committed by, as state policy, was committed by in the name of Serbs and by Bosnian Serb leadership. And so that's very different, is to understand the difference and understand that, for example, Bosniaks were not running around attacking and marauding and committing mass rape and beheading and taking babies and putting them in ovens and killing children in front of their parents and parents in front of their children. And I think you know all of what I'm referring to. No, Bosniaks were not doing this, but the UN apparatus had conjured up a concept here where all sides. This is literally when you would hear, when you would raise these. I'm telling you, and I don't even mention where else I was in Bosnia during the war, and in the Herzegovina, we lost we had Central Bosnia as well. So that was the mindset. The mindset was, we want to see all sides equivalent because we don't want to intervene and we don't want NATO to intervene. So that's the driver there is the willingness of any peacekeeping apparatus to see reality for what it is, to put on the glasses and to see and to call out the actions and be willing to, and not to do fake relativizing, because that ultimately that is what led to Srebrenica. And you should remember this: the Srebrenica was completely avoided, 100% of it. And NATO had the ability, the Dutch had the ability to call NATO. It was done in a token way, and when we know from what later transpired, and we were determined. I was there in Zepa to do what we could do, what I could do, with our limited means to prevent and avoid and minimize the risks of further trauma to the population. But at how much higher levels, this was entirely avoidable, as was seen either way. Unfortunately, they're way too late, and unfortunately, it's not easy. It's kind of achieved.
So we're talking about balance. You said there was no balance. You were in revise and change from both sides. Now, here today, we have the concept of one side. Then you revise, because there's nothing that's changing. You still have the attacks on the like so the concept of all sides is revised. The concept of one side is clarified, but it's still very biased. Or something like this. What do you suggest? What would be another revision?
Sure, I don't think, in my view, just in terms of third thing, I don't think that there's some bias. I don't see any bias today. I can see people are giving their own views. In a very open and clear ways. So I don't see this at all in that context. So you know, when it comes to war in Gaza, I see, you know, what you see. You see people who actively protest and say Israel is responsible, and then you have others who say, "Hey, why are you pulling down posters of hostages? You know, innocent kids who were seized." They're held captive, even if they probably not much older than Honey. They could come out to books. Many of those people in the books, they were peace activists. A lot of them were peace activists. They were very active, working in Gaza. Had contacts, connections, things like this. In my view, it's very different. I see where it's very open. Exchange. People are allowed to voice their views. I see also the media, and the media reports things that remind me that there's no shortage of reporting. In Russia and Ukraine, I think very different. We didn't see Ukrainians launching into Russian speakers and they're Russian, ethnic Russian, the Russian speakers go to Ukraine and attacking them, killing children in front of their parents, killing parents in front of their kids. I mean, we didn't see that. We saw a country that was invaded in 2015. There was basically skirmishing continuing, and it was ceasefire agreement, and those agreements that were not implemented. And then one side decided, well, unprovoked, no attacks, no mass rapes, and anything like that. One side decided we wanted to invade Iran. Yes, you said how do I see it? That's how I see it. Last question, please.
So I'm still asking, if you had the opportunity, two questions. If you had the opportunity to meet the president of the Zepa, who also was on the law, and what you thought of him and his contribution.
Yes.
But the main question is, what do you think was the main reason that prevented the genocide and the atrocity happening in Zepa as well? For contributing for the safe evacuation of most of the inhabitants.
I'll tell you, I want to mention the names. I'm glad you mentioned that because it wasn't only of the politics. Mehmet Hague, who, as you say, who was the young, very young imam and municipality president, and it was Amir Imamovich, the president of civil defense. All three of them lost their lives. All three were ultimately executed along with other college. So you can also ask Jasmin his view. What I attributed a lot to the leadership and heroism of our college. So this is what happened. You heard Jasmin tell the story. By refusing to surrender. And I think the heroism is college and all the citizens of Zepa, by holding out, by refusing to surrender. This is so important. How the lives were saved. I'm telling you, I was there on the ground. I was dealing with knowledge. We didn't know about Srebrenica, but we sure knew. I had, Ratko Mladic was not. This was a killer. So this was incredible that they were able to hold that for this period of time. What happened? It gave, as Jasmin mentioned, it gave time for this coalition of Bosnian advance in the West, which ultimately proved to be the climactic event with the airstrikes. So the way the war ended, that's how the war ended. They didn't have boots on the ground, except in just sort of calling in airstrikes and things like this. But the boots on the ground were Bosniaks and Croats advancing together, changing the dynamic of the battle. And I'll tell you, I saw this myself personally, because Mladic disappeared like that. And the force has disappeared. And I'll tell you one other thing, Jasmin, which is great credit to the outgunned, outnumbered, defied army, the Bosniaks who were there defending with Turkey. These Serbs had great fear of mounting an advance against the Bosniaks, who were scattered, deprived, limited ammunition, worn down, physically weakened. They had fear, and I saw that. I saw the respect and the fear that the Serbs had, and that's why we're there. I consider Albert College really a hero. He didn't have to be there. Yes, with anything and everything in your points.
There was one more question.
It's not a question, it's just a comment.
Yes.
So we spoke a lot, so I'm Bosnian, by the way, I'm Bosniak. My dad's from Montenegro, I'm also Venezuelan, so I have no sort of connection to Zepa, but just so everyone can understand, sort of as a Bosniak, what the people of Zepa sort of mean even today, 30 years later. So the professor always, continually use the phrase, Zepa didn't fall. So let's say, someone's telling me about the professor who's, Bosnian, he's saying, he's a drunk, he's a drug user, he's, the worst of society, et cetera. But then if he tells me that he's also from Zepa, my answer would be, Ali Zepa Zepa, but Zepa didn't fall. So just sort of the heroism and the moral and character that these people exhibited, it doesn't matter, someone can tell me you're the worst of the worst, but if you're from Zepa, I know you can, just because of what, people like Jasmin's father and all the other great men and people like the mother who mentioned what they really mean to this day, not just for Bosnia, but to the greater Bosniak community. So, thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm going to have to bring this to a close. Jasmin, I'm going to thank you. This was a powerful, moving, very personal, as we had hoped, description of your own experiences and your experience at SAIS. And I think this has meant a lot to our audience and to our audience at home. And this will be posted. FBI will post this, and folks can read this. And I think very good. Thank you so much.
Okay.
Welcome.